The plane took off from Hawaii's Hilo International Airport. The flight was traveling to Honolulu, less than an hour away. The weather was glorious, conditions were optimal, but just after a few minutes after takeoff, a massive boom suddenly jolted the entire plane. Without any warning, the roof cabin covering the first class cabin was explosively ripped away. Passengers and flight crew were panicked. Would they be sucked out in the big blue sky? Would they be able to do an emergency landing? Would the rest of the plane break? If you want to find out what happened, stay tuned as we take off this terrifying story and many more like it, including Captain Robert Costaimer and First Officer Madeline Tompkins. Together they had more than 10,000 hours of flight experience with this model of aircraft, Boeing 737. The plane was 19 years old, about 10 years from the end of its expected lifetime. And only that day it had made 3 round-trip flights, Hilo, Maui, and Kauai. Nothing unusual is noted in the pre-departure inspection. The plane had recently passed a Boeing service bulletin and an airworthiness directive by 2 separate inspectors. On paper, the aircraft was in top condition and ready to go. However, as one passenger was getting on, she looked over the boarding bridge and noticed crack in the aircraft's fuselage, halfway between the aircraft door and the bridge hood. She assumed the staff must have known about it and said nothing to the ground crew or the personnel. While pre-flight checks were cleared, the plane took off without any incident. The aircraft began its ascent, climbed further and further, with passengers still being shown the seatbelt on signs. As the pilots started leveling off the plane at 24,000 feet, that's when they heard a huge cacophonous eruption, followed by the rushing sound of wind. Officer Tompkins' head was flung back, and she saw pieces of debris like insulation foam floating around in the cockpit. It was then the pilots looked back, noticed the entry door to the cockpit was missing. At the first class ceiling should be. All they could see now was blue sky out in first class. Passengers were clinging to their seats, utterly terrified. Witnessed a small section, left-hand side of the plane suddenly rupture, had led to explosive decompression of the cabin and 300 miles per hour wind ripping off the roof. Now aircraft have cabin air systems that control pressurization, airflow, and temperature. The higher up in the atmosphere, the less oxygen there is and colder it gets. These systems are critical. Passengers don't suffocate is on their flight. Closing decompressions happen to systems stop working, which is why on passenger plane mask dropped from the ceiling. However, on flight 243, an 18-foot section of the roof and sides had been off above the passenger's head, along with their oxygen masks, thankfully still trapped on their seats. But the cabin crew that had been standing had to cling on to anything they could, even being swept off their feet. Tragically, one didn't make it in time. One attendant, Clarabelle Lansing, was immediately swept off the hole appeared in the left side of the aircraft. Number 2 attendant Michael Honda was thrown to the ground but managed to crawl and checked on passengers and tried to keep them calm. The cockpit still mostly intact. The pilots donned their oxygen masks. They realized quickly that all of their controls were left closing. The plane was rolling left and right, threatening to drop off the sky any second, and turned their transponder into an emergency code to notify Honolulu, and they needed to land in a nearby mall. The noise of cockpit was so loud, no transmission could be heard. Pilots couldn't communicate with the flight attendants or even hear one another. Resorting to hand signals, they began an emergency descent. Wasting no time, they dropped fast at the point of plummeting down, more than 4,100 feet per minute. The ideal rate of descent in passengers just traveling about 10,000 feet is around 3,000 feet per minute. It went a steeper, uncontrollable drop. But considering Flight 243's an uncontrollable situation, they just needed to get down on the ground as fast as possible. eventually dropped below 14,000 feet. Tompkins was able to reach Mayu's emergency channel and request an emergency landing along with medical equipment. What she assumed would be a lot of captions. I began preparation at Kahuli airport as the passengers in first class began to suffocate from the lack of oxygen. When they made it below 10,000 feet, campus cost timer slowed down the aircraft in accordance with air traffic control speed limitations. At this height, they could at least breathe. And plane to gradually as he slowed down to 170 knots, about 195 miles per hour. He noticed the plane became less responsive. To land, he needed to bring at least 130 knots, around 50 miles per hour slower. But he had no choice. It was either to slow down and lose control of the plane in the air, or making it to the runway and risk crashing in a super speedy landing. A breakneck 170 knots it was. He ordered Tompkins to lower the landing gear. The main gear light flashed green, but one extension light wasn't green. The nose gear wasn't down. Manually overrode the computer to drop it, but the light refused to illuminate. Tried it one more time and pulled the override handle down. The light still wasn't on. Usually they'd be able to check if it was down through a viewer, but it was blocked, and instead of wasting time, the captain insisted on immediately landing. If he was wrong and the front gear wasn't down, they were hit at most 200 miles per hour slower. Without anything, it would be guaranteed crash. I had no choice but to pray. Hopefully, those landing gear indicator lights were not malfunctioning. The nose gear was indeed down. Timer and Tompkins hit the runway, successfully landing. The emergency services at Kahuli airport. Everyone's jaws dropped. The plane had been ripped open like a can of sardines. 59 passengers and crew, 65 of them were injured seriously and one cerebral lancing fatally, and two was damaged beyond repair.